Company will prepare to halt. Halt. Company to the left. Left. Face. Company will ground arms. Company will stand easy. Ladies and gentlemen, this would have been typical of what you would have seen during the Williamite Wars. We had just tipped in from the English Civil War, and we were tipping into a more modern type army yet again. You had the modern army of the Roundheads, where they become tactical and more organised and more standardised in their weapons. And we went a little bit further then, as in we decided we wanted to distinguish who we were, because everybody just fought in what they had. On the end here, we would have sort of the in-betweener, as in he's coming from the English Civil War period into the Williamite period. And you can see he's dressed slightly different. He's dressed in a uniform that was basically a farmer's clothes, and he was brought off the land to fight for his lord and master. And not all the regiments got fancy red coats now, it just depended on how the purse extended. But you can see he's got modernised. He's lost his matchlock, which was the weapon fired by a bit of string, and he's now got a flintlock, which gives him a supposedly faster rate of fire. But he still has got a few of the old equipments left over, as in his 12 apostles. And the 12 apostles each carried a measured amount of gunpowder to load his weapon, and a priming flask, and a bullet bag. This is his bread bag, whereby he carried all his worldly goods whilst on the campaign, and where he would have carried his daily ration of bread and cheese, which was the staple diet while on the move. And we'll go through what happened after that. The loading system was quite slow, as in he emptied his powder down the musket. He then had to fitter about in his bullet bag to get a bullet. He then had to bend down and pluck grass for wadding, because he just used the grass they were treading on for wadding. And then he had to ram the whole piece. At this stage, there was no real orders for make ready to fire. There was no systematic way of doing it. You just done it your own perfection. You then shouldered your arm, and that let the captain know that you were ready to fire. Once that order was given, and then we'll not do it now, but we'll do it at the end, where he would make ready to fire, and he would produce his weapon and go into full cock and fire. Still used in the Williamite Wars, were used as auxiliaries, cannon fodder, whatever. Maybe used as skirmishers to go in front, check out villages and different things. Although the weapons weren't, the musket was up to scratch, the loading and that wasn't, but they were normally better hunters. They had better skills maybe than the farmer, and they were picked for their job. You then come into the more modern, which you would recognise more as Williamite uniforms as their own. I think you might think this is a Jacobite regiment, which it is. Dillon's was a Jacobite regiment, but also it was Royal Artillery uniform as well. It also was the Scots Greys uniform. And the big problem of the Williamite Wars and the Jacobite Williamite War was you had two factions fighting against each other who basically were from the same side. At this stage, the coats were all red, basically, except for a few exceptions. And the reason for that was red was the cheapest dye. So they were always red coats. But how you told the difference at this stage of the game was by their cuffs and their pantaloons. And the cuffs told you what regiment they belonged to. So on both sides you had a great conflicting colours and different regiments. There's only so many colour variations you can have, so that made it a bit awkward. So you had the standard kit, and you had your colours, and that was it. A regiment, and attached to that then, in charge of the men was the captain, who I represent, and the captain didn't carry a musket. He carried a pistol if he could gather one up off the field. He had a sword, but the most important thing was his halberd. And this is a genuine Williamite halberd, found in thatch in a cottage in Cumber. And this is what William would have brought with him from, it was his symbol. The French and the Jacobite one was two, which we have as well, which is 2 prongs down, 2 prongs up, and a spear, and that represented the sunburst, because Louis was known as the sunburst, the Sun King. So that always identified the Jacobite regiment was the sunburst, and that this type of halberd. You also got just little spears across in them, but this was basically what we used. My job was, I was in charge of anywhere between 60 and 100 men as a captain. There was no sergeants or colonels or nobody. The only position was Lord Master and the captain and the drummer. We'll come on to the drummer in a minute or two. He was a very important man in the whole field. But this year, and I could come along and keep the men in line and keep them in set and point directions, because as you can imagine, as a battle was going on, the noise, the smoke, the confusion, a drummer was used to indicate what you really wanted you to do, but that really wasn't always the cause. So I could hold this up to put it forward, or to go forward, or to go back, and this was sort of what I raved about, to tell you what you were to do and what you weren't to do. But also my job was to stand behind, to the side or the back of the advancing men, and if I didn't think they were going far enough, I prodded them on. And if I thought you were going to desert, I would stake you there and then. So as the men knew they had to keep going forward, there's no option here, this was the way you must go. So maybe it just was a tough wee nut, as you see portrayed on the whole thing. You had to be ruthless to keep order within your men, so as they didn't desert and they didn't do whatever. I mentioned there a drummer, and a drummer, as you see in the Napoleonic Wars and that, were sort of young boys, 12, 13, 14, but at this time the drummer was about one of the most important and highly educated men on the field, and was never shot, was always respected by both sides. The drummer was the safest job to have. It was only by accident that you got wiped out. Because the drummer was a highly educated man. He maybe spoke 4 different languages. He could read and write in all those different languages, and he could understand the whole thing and had very high status. And the reason for that was, if it ever come to be terms had to be done between the 2 sides, i.e. a surrender or whatever negotiation the opposing sides done at that time, it was the drummers that come together from each opposing side and wrote up the terms and conditions. And they were always signed on the drum. So if the Williamite and Jacobite, two lords or 2 captains or 2 whatever, had decided they'd had enough and they were surrendering, well, the terms was drawn up by the drummers and signed and dealed by the drummers. So they were they're always in their 30s, 40s, highly educated men. So they were very important. Drummers, it's not what you imagine as the other times. So it was, so that they were sort of the scribes, the personal secretaries, but they drummed. And they were always standing beside the hierarchy, rattling, and they would shout out the drum and the different drum rolls to move the men. But generally speaking, an advancing army it was advanced. We were just saying to the guys earlier on there, they were saying how did they advance. They always advanced in line, and you maybe had 1,600, whatever it was, coming, but there could have been 5 lines. But the front line was always kept to the fore. So if I dropped or shot in the front line, the guy standing directly behind me filled my space. There's no such thing as letting gaps get up. So as anybody was dropped, the next guys march forward and take their place and keep marching forward. We'll come to the loading of the gun and the musket at this section, because it had advanced somewhat. They had discovered, the French especially, and the French, more importantly the French trained regiments, didn't actually load and fire as the Williamites did. They had this terrible notion, and maybe some people still say, do you have a trampoline out over the top of you? And what they done was they fixed bayonets, which will show you how they done, and they kept marching forward. Well, the English, or the Williamite armies, colonels and captains discovered if they could stop them on the line and they couldn't advance, they stopped and retreated. And very rare, because they always were mealy-mouthed, they had loads and loads of men, so they used them as cannon fodder and gun fodder, and they didn't like wasting their money on the gunpowder. So they never let off many shots or volleys. They maybe had wee skirmishers out, taking out the captains and taking out the guy, the head, take the head off and the body runs mad. So they were out maybe picking them off, but they kept marching forward with their bayonets fixed. So they discovered we have to learn how to load quicker. So what they discovered was making up a paper cartridge. Instead of having the apostles looking for your bullet and bending down for grass for wadding, Kevin will maybe handle his cartridge. They came up with a clever idea of making a paper cartridge. And the paper cartridge, paper was quite expensive at that time, but it was a lot cheaper than replacing men and a whole lot of things, so they used their hand. Paper cartridge was this, loaded up the night before. Each man only got 8 or 12 cartridges for the day. And they poured their gunpowder in, and then they put their lead bullet on the top, and then they sealed it into like a wee tube like this. So this is where the term biting the bullet comes from, because when you handled your cartridge, you bit the bullet and held it in your mouth from the top of the cartridge. So whenever the mouse says you bit the bullet, you're going to do something. You've opened the cartridge and you're about to go. Then you poured your powder in. Then you spat the bullet down the barrel. You crumpled the wadding up and you hammered that, put that down the barrel, and then you rammed it home. And that then let you fire 3 rounds a minute. And the spacing was, the armies, the lines would have been from here to the wall roughly. They were roughly sort of 8 to 10 yards apart. So the first line was marching up, and these muskets are not accurate under no, they're just they're like a big shotgun going off with individual pellets coming out. They could go 30 degrees either way. Elevation was quite good, but left and right was very bad in accuracy, because you were working with a bullet, non-rifled barrel, just rattled down the barrel and come out. So they shot in a volume, and that would have dropped this line. But the second advancing line coming from the French or the Jacobite army, if you could get the second shot off just as they approached where you dropped the first line, that would make them hesitant. And if you were reloaded and ready to go by the time they got the third line come up, and if you dropped them before they could get in front of the line, the 2 lines you'd already dropped, they would beat retreat. But if they ever could get one leg over the top of that line, they would count that advancing and still keep coming forward. And even in Napoleonic times, they still used that tactic. You of course then had the threat of horse. And horse, the cavalry units, there was heavy horse and there was dragoons. The dragoon was soldier just like you see standing in front of you, only he was on a horse, and he's quite versatile. He was like cavalry, as in he could work as cavalry with a light sword, but their important job was they sat up on the hill with his lordship, and if they seen a line weakening anywhere out during the battle, the dragoons would be sent down in to plug the gap. And they done that 3 ways. They flew down on their horses. They had 2 big pistols like this mounted on their saddle, and they could ride into the line and they could pop off their 2 shots. That might be enough to stop the advancement of the advancing lines of your enemy. If that wasn't going to work, they then retreated to where the line, the British line was, or the Williamite line was, and they would dismount, and the guys would hold their horses, and they'd short carbines. Because they were on horses who were quite small, they were maybe in around this height here, and they were known as carbines, and they could load their carbines on the horse, but it was quite awkward because horses are dashing and flopping about, so they would dismount it and form the line. Two things was going to happen at this stage. They either were in to let off 3 or 4 shots waiting on the reserve marching up, whereby when the reserve line company marched up, they got on their horses and retreated back up the hill again and reloaded and got ready to go again. But if there was no reserve left, the horses was given to the gallopers who remounted and took 4 or 5 horses apiece and galloped them up to the top of the hill, whereby you had more, because there was more men than horses, they were expensive, you had then the reserves would mount up on the horse and be ready to charge in and do the same again. So they were quite an important outfit. And if you, during the migration years to the Americas, that's where your 7th Cavalry and all come from, was the original of these type of troops. So from the Dragoons. And the Dragoons were formed by Winds, who mostly from Enniskillen Castle. They come up with this idea and it expanded as the battles went along. So you had your Dragoon troop and you had your foot troop. And what we had also lost from the English Civil War was the pikemen. And the pike were 14 foot long, roughly touched the ceiling. I didn't bring one with me because we reckoned it would touch the ceiling. But you had your pikemen, but they had lost their favourite this time, because you used to have 600 block of men during the English Civil War and 20 or 30 muskets, or flint or matchlocks, which are the burning string type ones, because they were very expensive and very hard to come by, and gunpowder was very hard to come by. So they were, but at this period the whole thing had swung right round, whereby you maybe kept 30 or 40 pikemen to your 600 muskets. And the pikemen always were at the back and were never really used much in the fighting. The only time they were ever brought forward was for the charge of horse. So if you had heavy horse come and charge down to you, they called the pikemen in and they helped to deflect them off. But you'll notice that this is what they call the long pattern, longland pattern. And they're quite a long musket. You get the shortland pattern comes in later on where they chop about a foot off them. But the reason why they had them this long was to give them a wee bit more accuracy in the firing, but also they couldn't get away from their tactic of pike. So the bayonet was fixed. So we'll ask our trooper here to fix bayonets. It's known as a plug bayonet, not as a bayonet as you would know in a weapon, modern weapon today, which fit round the barrel. These went down the barrel because they hadn't put that technology or thought of that at this time. And then they would use them the same way as their pike, whereby your pike was driven into the ground, you put your foot on top of it and you dropped it. So that, as you can see, that still gives quite a reasonable deterrent to charging horse. Not as good as your 14 or 16 foot pike, which you can imagine coming out to here. But then you also would have then had some pikemen coming in just to balance that up, so it still gives you the glancing off. And your second row would have stepped forward then with their musket, and as they turned sideways or they turned at you, they would have put a volley into them. It was a very nasty, bloody, horrible war, with more casualties than actually anybody killed outright in the battlefield. You died more of your wounds than you did of actual been shot outright. If you imagine the statistics, and I know warfare tactics change, but for every 52,000 shots fired in a battle, you kill one person, outright, clean outright, in the Williamite Wars. When you get to the Napoleonic Wars, it actually drops a bit. It comes down to 49,000 because there's more rifled barrels than that, but they were still fighting that line up and charging each other warfare. But if you take it up to Iraq, it took 1.2 million rounds to kill one person outright. And okay, they were hiding in bunkers and they were hiding differently, but it just shows you, what was more accurate, the old-fashioned blunderbuss or the modern high-tech weapons of today. So that gives you maybe just something to look at in the whole thing. But what generally happened was you got broken bones more than anything else with the clashing of swords, and they would have basically a club musket. You'll see the muskets have got brass ends and butts attached to them. And that's because whenever you're 12 rounds gone, you turn your musket round and use it as a club. And you battered your way through the lines. And then you'd have used your sword or your club bayonet then as stabbing and jabbing weapons after that. Because remember, you're only going out there with 8 or 10 rounds, so you're not long dispersing them off in a day's battle.